What is the true cost of unconditional love for Helen Carter, a 68-year-old widow and artist living quietly in Vermont? The answer came in a moment of devastating clarity when her beloved granddaughter Madison called her handmade birthday gift cheap in front of a crowd of laughing teenagers. After decades of sacrifice, 12 years of skipped doctor appointments, clipped coupons, and winters spent shivering to save on heating bills, all to build an $85,000 college fund for a dream that wasn't even her own, Helen finally faces the painful truth she has become invisible, a vessel for others' needs with nothing left for herself. But sometimes, the deepest wounds become unexpected doorways to freedom. When Helen discovers the calculated betrayal behind Madison's cruelty, she makes a decision that will transform not just her relationship with her family, but her entire understanding of her own worth. The Rejected Gift is a powerful story about finding your voice when the world expects silence, discovering your value when others have discarded it, and building a life that finally belongs to you not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as yourself. As Helen's journey unfolds from invisible to unforgettable, she proves that it's never too late to pick up the paintbrush of your own life and create something beautiful from the canvas of betrayal. Helen Carter stood by the window of her modest Vermont home, watching snowflakes dance in the winter air. At 68, her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and the lines on her face told stories of both joy and sorrow. A widow for nearly a decade, she had built a quiet life filled with watercolors, bird watching, and memories mostly of Madison. Madison was her granddaughter, though that word seemed too formal for what they had been to each other. When Lauren, Helen's daughter, had Madison at 22, she was overwhelmed with 2 jobs just to stay afloat. So Madison spent her early years with Helen, finger painting in the kitchen, riding her tricycle on the cracked driveway, and helping Helen pick dandelions for bouquets that wilted in jelly jars by the window. Nana? Madison would call her not Grandma, not Granny, just Nana, with a tenderness that made the simple word feel sacred. Those years had been golden despite their simplicity. Madison's laughter had filled every corner of Helen's small house. They'd spend hours at the kitchen table, Helen teaching Madison about colors and shapes, the little girl's attention rapt as if Helen were sharing the secrets of the universe. But time moved forward relentlessly. Madison grew older. The world began to take over where Helen had once been enough. iPads replaced storybooks. Social media became more interesting than kitchen painting sessions. Friends became the center of Madison's world. Helen hadn't fought it. She'd stood back, proud but quietly heartbroken, watching Madison's life drift into something she barely recognized. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. By the time Madison was 16, she only seemed to appear when she needed something money for a school trip, a ride when Lauren couldn't manage it, help with a project she'd left until the last minute. Yet through it all, Helen's love never wavered. Even as Madison changed, Helen saw glimpses of that creative, loving child beneath the teenager's carefully constructed facade. For 12 years, Helen had done something Madison never knew about. Every month, Helen put aside whatever she could from her fixed-income birthday money from distant relatives, grocery savings from clipping coupons, even occasionally skipping medications when things were tight, all to build a college fund for Madison. Helen knew Madison dreamed of attending California Institute of the Arts, that shiny, expensive school all the artistic kids talked about. The tuition was astronomical, the living costs worse. But Helen believed in Madison's dream, even after Madison had stopped painting years ago, even after she never mentioned art school anymore. Sometimes, Helen would open the folder labeled Madison's College Fund just to look at the balance growing slowly but steadily. $85 for 32? It represented 1,000 small sacrifices the winter coat Helen had mended instead of replaced, the doctor's appointments she'd postponed, the thermostat kept low during Vermont winters to save on heating bills. Helen's refrigerator still displayed Madison's childhood drawings, now faded and curling at the edges. Her bookshelves still showcased clay sculptures from elementary school art classes. In the spare bedroom, Helen kept a box of Madison's early paintings vibrant, messy works full of the joy only a child could express. Perhaps it was foolish to hold on so tightly to who Madison had been rather than who she was becoming. But Helen couldn't help it. That little girl with paint-stained fingers and an unrestrained laugh still lives somewhere in Helen's heart, alongside the growing college fund that would one day help Madison become whoever she was meant to be. For Madison's 18th birthday, Helen wanted to give her something more meaningful than money. She wanted to remind Madison of who she used to be, of the bond they once shared. So Helen decided to paint her a gift. Not just any painting a memory captured on canvas. She spent weeks on it, her arthritic hands sometimes aching so badly she'd have to stop. But still, she continued. Every stroke was deliberate, infused with love and memories. She painted the old wooden swing in the backyard, the one Madison had loved when she was 5. She included Max, the golden retriever they'd had until Madison was 10. She added the daffodils that had bloomed outside Madison's window every April. A soft watercolor sky stretched above it all, the kind of perfect blue that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Helen wrapped the painting carefully in brown craft paper and tied it with a white satin ribbon. She slipped a little card inside that read, "May your future be as bright as the little girl you used to be." She smiled as she placed it in the back seat of her car, heart full and hopeful. The party wasn't anything like the birthdays Helen used to throw backyard barbecues with cake baked from scratch, streamers hung with tape and love. No, this was a glossy affair. Lauren had gone all out white linen tables under a rented tent, a catered buffet, a DJ playing music Helen didn't recognize. Madison had a whole table just for her gifts, stacked high with boxes wrapped in designer paper. Everything screamed money, everything except for Helen and her humble package. She stood there in her old gray cardigan, clutching the painting like it was made of glass. No one really noticed she'd arrived. Madison wore a tight pink dress and heels higher than Helen could ever manage. She moved from table to table, laughing loudly, taking selfies with friends who barely acknowledged Helen's existence. Eventually, Lauren spotted her and forced a polite smile. "Oh, you made it," she said, as if Helen were a distant cousin rather than the woman who had once changed her child's diapers. "Where should I put this?" Helen asked, motioning to the gift. "You can just put it with the others," Lauren replied, already turning away. But Helen didn't. Something told her to wait. She wanted to give it to Madison herself. She needed to, when Madison finally got around to opening her gifts. The crowd gathered around. People recorded with their phones as she tore through boxes containing designer bags, cash cards, AirPods, and other expensive items. Then she reached Helen's gift. Helen watched as Madison paused, examining the humble wrapping. "Oh, this one's from my Nana," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She unwrapped the paper, opened the box, and held up the painting. There was a moment of silence. Then came the laugh. "Are you serious?" Madison said, holding it up like it was some kind of joke. "A painting, that's it. This must have been cheaper than buying a real gift." The kids around her snickered. Someone muttered, "Vintage vibes, I guess." Lauren gave Helen a quick, uncomfortable look, but said nothing to defend her or the gift. "It's sweet, I guess," Madison added with a shrug, propping the painting against the table leg like a forgotten decoration. Everyone moved on. No one saw Helen's face. That's the thing about being invisible. No one notices when you're in pain. Helen turned and walked back to her car, each step feeling like she was dragging years behind her. Years of birthday cakes baked alone. Years of scraped knees kissed better. Years of whispered prayers over bills just so Madison could have ballet shoes, or paint supplies, or summer camp. She sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine off. She didn't cry loudly. She didn't sob. She just stared at her hands on the steering wheel, watching as a tear slid down and landed right on her wedding band. When Helen got home that night, she didn't bother turning on the lights. She just walked into the kitchen, set her purse on the counter, and stood there in the dark. The silence of the house wrapped around her like an old friend. She glanced toward her painting corner. The easel stood bare, the table beside it cluttered with brushes and tubes of paint, untouched since she'd finished Madison's birthday gift. That painting had taken her weeks of aching wrist and blurred vision. Weeks of waking up at night because she'd thought of one more detail to add. She called it cheap, Helen whispered to herself. And they all laughed. Helen walked to the hallway and opened the drawer where she kept the folder labeled College Fund, Madison. It was thick, stuffed with every document, receipt, and printout from the savings account she'd built over 12 long years. Every deposit, every transfer, every small sacrifice was documented there. She'd skipped new clothes, haircuts, and even basic home repairs. She'd canceled cable years ago. Every time she put that money aside, she told herself, it'll be worth it. She's worth it. Helen turned on her old desktop computer, logged into the online banking portal, and typed in her password. The balance blinked on the screen, $85.30. She stared at it for a long time. She knew exactly what every dollar had cost her. Then she clicked transfer, not to Madison, not to the college fund, but to her personal checking account. She watched as the progress bar moved slowly, as if waiting for her to change her mind. But she didn't. Not this time. Transfer complete. Balance $0. She closed the folder, shut the drawer, and turned off the computer. No one needed to know. Not yet. She wasn't doing it out of spite or revenge. It was something else, a quiet decision made in the storm of humiliation. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. Not her daughter, not her granddaughter, not the idea of what a good grandmother should be. Just Helen. She made a cup of tea the right way, this time warm, with honey. She sat in the quiet, sipped slowly, and let the silence heal a tiny piece of her. She didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel angry. She just felt done. The next afternoon, Helen received a text. "Hi, Nana. Can I stop by today? Miss you?" Helen stared at the screen for a long time. Madison hadn't called her Nana in months, maybe longer. 2 hours later, there she was, Madison on the porch with a tray of cookies from that expensive bakery downtown, the kind Helen could never afford but always admired in the window. "Nana," she chirped, wrapping her arms around Helen before she could even react. Helen stiffened. Her body remembered the party, Madison's voice echoing, her laughter stabbing like cold glass. But she let her granddaughter hug her. Madison smelled like expensive shampoo and sugar, nothing like childhood anymore. "I was just thinking about you," Madison said, walking into the kitchen like she used to when she was small. "I wanted to apologize for the party. I was just overwhelmed. I didn't mean what I said." She sat at the table, folded her hands. Her nails were perfect, her phone glowing softly in her lap. "I shouldn't have said that about the painting. It was really sweet of you. It's actually beautiful." Helen nodded slowly, trying to read the expression on Madison's face. Was it real? She wanted it to be real. I've missed you, Madison added. I know I haven't been around. Things got busy, but I'm here now. She took Helen's hand across the table. Her eyes shimmered, almost like tears. I've been thinking a lot about college, she said quietly, about Cal Arts. I know the fund is, well, complicated now, but I just want to be close to you again. I'm not here for the money. Nana, I swear, I just miss us. The words wrapped around Helen like ivy, soft, familiar, dangerous. She felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe Madison was growing up. Maybe the shame at the party had awakened something inside her. Maybe Helen had been too harsh. After all, Madison was young, stupid. We've all been that. I'll think about things, Helen told her gently. But I'm glad you're here. Madison smiled the big one, the same smile from when she was 7 and used to draw pictures of rainbows and write, I love you, Nana, in shaky crayon. They ate cookies. Madison stayed for dinner. She helped wash the dishes and asked about Helen's latest paintings. She even brought up childhood memories, the swing, Max, the daffodils. Helen's heart began to believe again, to soften. Later that night, she opened the college fund folder again. She didn't transfer anything, but she thought about it. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Madison had learned something. Or maybe Helen just wanted her love so badly. She was willing to be wrong. Tuesday afternoon changed everything. Madison had come over that morning with her laptop, saying she needed help printing a scholarship form. Helen had been the techie of the family since the 90s, even if now she could barely update a phone. Madison left after lunch in a rush to meet friends. Helen stayed in the kitchen washing dishes, humming a little tune they both used to love. Maybe this is healing, she thought. Maybe we're really rebuilding something. Then she went into the study. Madison's laptop was still there open, humming softly, screen still glowing. She was going to close it, just click it shut and send Madison a text. But the screen caught her eye. There was a chat window open, a messaging app Helen didn't recognize. At the top, it read Madison chatting with Emmy. Her gut told her to look away, but something deeper, something primal, told her to read. The last message hit her like a slap. Don't worry, she's falling for it. I've been sweet, cried a bit, told her I missed our bond. Classic emotional bait. She always melts with that family crap. Helen's hands trembled. Another message blinked below it, fresh and ruthless. Just need a couple more visits. She's already thinking about putting the fun back. I know it. Told you. She's predictable. I'll be in Cal Arts by fall. Manifesting. Helen stared at the words. They weren't just cruel, they were calculated. This wasn't a mistake or a slip of the tongue. It was a plan. Everything, the visits, the hugs, the stories about Max and the daffodils. Every tear, every cookie was a script written to manipulate her. Helen didn't know how long she stood there. Her legs finally carried her to the sofa, and she sat down slowly, laptop still open on her lap, the words blaring like neon signs. Every Nana, I missed you played in her head like a broken record, and each one sounded faker than the last. She felt cold, like someone had turned off the sun. How had she not seen it? How had she fallen for it again? Madison's messages were peppered with emojis and exclamation points, like they weren't even written by the girl Helen raised. She sounded like a stranger worse, a predator targeting Helen's emotions, manipulating her heart, using love as a weapon. Helen wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound. Instead, she closed the laptop slowly, like shutting a casket. The grief was real, but this time it wasn't grief for a person she'd lost. It was for a person who had never really existed the version of Madison in her head. the sweet, curious child with paint on her cheeks who had once told Helen she was her best friend. That girl was gone. Maybe she'd been gone longer than Helen realized. Helen sat in silence for the rest of the day, letting it sink in. This wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal. And it wasn't accidental, it was intentional. That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat in her old rocking chair in the living room, a blanket around her shoulders. The house dark except for the faint yellow glow of the porch light leaking through the curtains. She kept hearing Madison's voice. She always melts with that family crap. Helen thought of all the times she had melted. When Lauren slammed doors and called her overbearing, Helen let it go. When Madison started visiting less, Helen convinced herself she was just busy. When she was forgotten on holidays, she baked cookies and dropped them off anyway. She had spent a lifetime sacrificing pieces of herself so no one would leave. She gave until there was nothing left, then gave more. Yeah. And for what? So her granddaughter could laugh behind her back, so she could be manipulated into handing over her life savings like some gullible, lonely old woman. Helen felt rage that night, not loud rage, not destructive. It was a quiet, focused kind of rage that sharpened her, that peeled the wool from her eyes and showed her who she'd become and who she was done being. Around 3 a.m., she got up and walked to the painting Madison had called cheap. She stood in front of it for a long time. The memories on that canvas no longer hurt. They weren't bruises anymore, they were proof. Proof that she had loved, that she had given her best, that she had been real even when they weren't. "You're not going into a closet," she whispered to the painting. "Not anymore." The next morning, Helen took a photo of the painting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she uploaded it to an online group for older women artists, a quiet corner of the internet where people posted their work, shared stories, and encouraged each other. In the caption box, she wrote, "This painting was called Cheap by someone I love, but it was painted with everything I had left. Every brushstroke is a memory, every color, a piece of my heart. Maybe it's not enough for some people, but it was everything to me." She hit post. She didn't expect much, maybe a few likes, a kind comment or two, but it wasn't about attention. It was about finally using her voice, not just her brushes, to tell the truth. When she woke up the next morning, her computer screen was glowing with notifications, likes, comments, shares. The painting had caught fire overnight. She clicked into the comments. "This made me cry. There's so much emotion here. Whoever called this cheap doesn't know what love is. Do you sell prints? I want this hanging in my home. Please tell me you're exhibiting somewhere." Messages started pouring in women who said they saw themselves in Helen's story. Women who'd been called too sentimental, too giving, too soft. Then one message stood out. "Hi, Helen. I'm Dana, a curator for a small gallery in Brooklyn. Your piece stopped me cold. Would you consider exhibiting it? We'd be honored." Helen read the message 3 times. Brooklyn, a gallery. She looked at the painting, still leaning quietly against the wall near the dining room. She answered with trembling hands, "Yes, I'd be honored, too." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Helen had never imagined needing an artist's biography, but now she found herself staring at a blank document, trying to summarize her life in a few paragraphs. Finally, she simply wrote, "Helen Carter, 68, artist. I paint what I've loved and lost, and what I've found along the way." Dana called regularly, explaining the exhibition process, discussing framing options, and helping Helen prepare for her first show. She was coming to Vermont herself to collect the painting, wanting to ensure its safe transport to Brooklyn. "What would you like to call it?" Dana asked during one of their conversations. Helen thought about it for a moment. The rejected gift, she said finally. There was a pause on the line. Perfect, Dana responded softly. When Dana arrived, she spent hours talking with Helen, not just about the painting, but about the story behind it. She listened with genuine interest as Helen shared memories of Madison's childhood, of their bond, of the slow drift apart. Your work speaks to so many people, Helen, Dana told her. There's a universal truth in what you've captured, the love we give that isn't always valued the way it should be. 2 months later, Helen stood in the small but elegant gallery in Brooklyn. It wasn't a massive exhibition. Her painting was part of a collection called Unheard Voices, featuring work from women artists over 60. But seeing the rejected gift hanging on a clean white wall, properly framed and lit, made Helen's heart swell. People moved around the gallery, stopping to look at her painting, reading the small card that contained her artist's statement. Some lingered longer than others, studying the details, the swing, the dog, the daffodils. We had 57 people at the opening, Dana whispered, appearing at Helen's side. Quite good for a first showing. A week after the exhibition opened, Dana called Helen with news. A private collector had expressed interest in buying the rejected gift. The offer was $5,000. You don't have to sell it, Dana assured her. Many artists keep their most personal pieces. Helen thought about it. Part of her wanted to keep the painting, to preserve that tangible connection to her past. But another part recognized that letting it go might be the final step in her healing. Tell him yes, Helen decided, but I'd like a good photograph of it first. She signed her first artist's contract that week. Dana sent her the check along with a professional photograph of the painting in its gallery setting. Helen looked at the check for a long time, amazed that something that had been called cheap was now valued by a stranger at $5,000. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about recognition of her work, her pain, her truth. Back home in Vermont, things were different. Lauren called once just to say she heard Helen's painting was getting attention. No apology, no congratulations, just curiosity. Helen didn't give her the details. Then Madison showed up. She hadn't called, just knocked on the door one afternoon with a tired expression and tear-glossed eyes. Helen almost didn't answer, but finally did. "Can we talk?" Madison asked. Helen stepped aside and let her in. They sat at the same kitchen table, where Madison used to eat cereal in her pajamas, where Helen had once helped her build science projects, where Madison used to tell Helen she was her favorite person in the whole world. Madison folded her hands and looked at Helen with the same face she'd watched grow for 18 years. "I saw the painting," she said. "Online. People are talking about you. About it?" Helen said nothing. "I wanted to say sorry again," Madison continued. "For the birthday party, for that, and for everything else." Still, Helen said nothing. Madison looked down, her hands fidgeting. "I messed up, Nana. I was stupid and selfish. I took you for granted, but I want to fix things." Helen leaned back, arms folded. "What do you mean, fix things?" Madison swallowed. "I still want to go to Cal Arts. And maybe, if things are different now, maybe you could—" There it was, the truth bleeding through the apology. Still chasing the money, still using her. Helen stood up. Madison looked up, confused. Helen didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply said, "You called my love cheap? You pretended to care because you thought I'd fund your dream again. You treated me like a transaction." Madison opened her mouth, but Helen held up her hand. "You lost something that day, Madison, not just money. You lost the one person who believed in you no matter what." Helen walked to the door and opened it. "You want something from me again? Earn it." Madison stood slowly, lips pressed into a thin line, pride wounded. Helen didn't expect a hug and didn't get one. Madison left without another word. Helen watched her walk down the porch steps, back to her car, back to whatever story she'd built to convince herself she deserved it all. And Helen went back inside alone, but finally whole. A week passed. Helen didn't hear from Madison, not a text, not a call. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It felt clean, like a space being cleared for something better. Then one morning, while Helen was sipping coffee on the porch, Lauren showed up. She didn't even knock, just barged in like it was still 2010 and she was dropping Madison off after daycare. Her heels clicked angrily against the wood floors. Her hair was perfect, her blazer stiff, her expression sharp. "I just came from Madison's," she said. "No, hello." Helen took another sip of coffee and waited. "She's crying. She says you humiliated her, that you made her feel like trash, that you're throwing her away over a painting." Helen said nothing. "She told me about the money, about the college fund. She said you took it back without warning." Still, Helen stayed quiet. She let Lauren talk. Lauren threw her hands up. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're sacrificing her future. You're punishing her for being young and stupid, for making one bad joke at a party." At that, Helen stood slowly. She walked to the counter, picked up the thick folder labeled College Fund, Madison, and held it up. "This," she said, voice calm, "is 12 years of my life. Every coupon clipped, every doctor visit skipped. Every winter I kept the heat low to save $50. This folder is my sacrifices," and she spat on it. She was upset. "No," Helen interrupted. "She was cruel. And then she came back and played nice to get it back. She didn't apologize. She performed. And I almost fell for it." Lauren crossed her arms. "So what now? You let her dreams fall apart." Helen looked her in the eye. "She's 18. She's not 5. If her dreams are real, she'll fight for them, work for them, not manipulate a woman who loves her." Lauren's face flushed with something guilt, anger. Helen couldn't tell. "I raised you better," Helen said softly, "and I raised her better. But somewhere along the way, you both learned how to take and forgot how to give back." Lauren looked away. Helen walked to the desk, pulled out a new folder, and set it down. This one was labeled in fresh black marker, Freedom Fund, Helen Carter. "I'm using the money now," Helen said. "Not on anyone else, on me." Lauren stared at it, mouth slightly open. "I gave you both decades," Helen said. "Now I'm taking a few years back." Lauren finally whispered, "You really won't pay for Cal Art?" "No," Helen said without hesitation. "I already paid in full with everything I had, and you threw it away." Lauren left in silence, and Helen poured another cup of coffee. Her hands didn't shake this time. In the weeks that followed, Helen began to rebuild her life not around Madison or Lauren, but around herself and her art. She used part of the money from selling The Rejected Gift to enroll in online art courses. She experimented with new techniques, explored styles she'd never tried before. She joined local art groups and began attending workshops at the community center. One day, she received an email from an arts magazine editor who had seen her work online. The editor wanted to feature Helen in a piece about late-blooming artists. The interview was conducted over the phone, and Helen shared her story, not mentioning Madison by name, but speaking about finding her voice after decades of silence. "My painting was dismissed," she said, "not because it lacked value, but because the person it was meant for didn't recognize love when it was right in front of her." The article wasn't a national sensation, but it resonated with readers in the region. Helen began receiving emails from women who saw themselves in her journey. She was invited to speak at a virtual conference for women over 60. She trembled as she prepared her notes, uncertain what wisdom she could possibly share. But when she logged on and saw the faces of women like her, women who had lived through loss and love and were still searching for meaning, the words came easily. "We are not invisible," she told them. "We are not expired. We are not defined by who loves us or who doesn't. We are defined by what we create, what we give, and what we finally allow ourselves to receive." After the conference, Helen was approached about teaching a beginner's art class at the community center. She had never thought of herself as a teacher, but the idea intrigued her. She prepared a 6-week course on watercolor basics, expecting perhaps 5 or 6 students. 15 showed up the first day, mostly retirees like herself, but also a few younger women. Even a man in his 30s who admitted he'd always wanted to try painting but had never found the courage. "That's what we're doing here," Helen told the class. "Finding courage through color." Teaching awakened something new in Helen. She loved watching her students discover their own styles, their own voices. She celebrated their small victories, guided them through frustrations, and found herself looking forward to each class with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. 6 months after her Brooklyn debut, Helen received an unexpected invitation. A small gallery in Montreal was putting together an exhibition called Across Borders, featuring artists from neighboring U.S. states and Canadian provinces. They had seen The Rejected Gift online and wanted to include Helen's work. This would be her first international show, not Paris or London, but still a significant step beyond Brooklyn. Montreal was only a few hours' drive from Vermont, but it felt like a world away to Helen, who had rarely traveled outside her state. She threw herself into creating new work for the exhibition. She painted Vermont landscapes in different seasons, each infused with the emotions she associated with those times of year. She created a series of smaller watercolors depicting quiet moments, a cup of tea by a window, a bird on a branch, hands her own holding a paintbrush. When the time came for the exhibition, Helen drove to Montreal herself, her car packed with carefully wrapped canvases. The gallery was in Old Montreal, with stone walls and large windows overlooking the cobblestone streets. The opening night was intimate but lively. Helen stood beside her displayed works, answering questions from visitors in her limited French and their limited English. There was a warmth to the interactions, a genuine appreciation for her work that transcended language barriers. "Your paintings have such honesty," one reviewer told her. "They're not trying to be anything other than what they are." Helen thought that was perhaps the best compliment she'd ever received. During her stay in Montreal, Helen met other artists, some younger, some her age, each with their own journey to share. She realized she wasn't alone in having found her voice later in life. Many had stories of sacrifice, of putting creative dreams on hold for family, of rediscovering themselves when they thought it was too late. One evening, Helen walked alone along the St. Lawrence River, watching the city lights reflect in the dark water. She thought about how far she had come, not just geographically, but emotionally. A year ago, she had been invisible, even to herself. Now, she was being seen, being heard, being valued not for what she gave to others, but for what she created from her own heart. 6 months after the Montreal exhibition, a letter arrived from Madison. Helen recognized the handwriting immediately. She sat with the unopened envelope for almost an hour, uncertain whether to read it or simply throw it away. Finally, she slid her finger under the flap and pulled out several pages of notebook paper. "Dear Nana," it began, "I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, but I need to try. I'm at State now, the local campus, not Cal Arts. I have a part-time job at a coffee shop and a small scholarship that covers some of the tuition. Mom helps with rent, but I'm learning to manage my own money for the first time. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me or proud of me. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and I haven't been honest with you in a long time. What I did was unforgivable. Not just at the party, but afterwards, trying to manipulate you. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why I became that person, someone who could hurt the one person who always believed in me. I think somewhere along the way, I started seeing love as a transaction. What could I get from it? What was the price? I forgot that real love doesn't have a price tag. I'm taking an intro to painting class this semester. The professor says I have raw talent that needs discipline. It reminded me of how you used to say the same thing when I was little. I'm not asking for anything. Nana, not money, not forgiveness, not even a response to this letter. I just wanted you to know that I'm learning, slowly, about the real cost of things. Love, Madison. Helen read the letter twice, then set it down. There was no manipulation she could detect, no hint of an angle being played. For the first time in years, Madison sounded like Madison. Not a perfect Madison, not the idealized child Helen had clung to in memory, but a real person struggling to grow. After a week of consideration, Helen sent a brief reply. Thank you for your letter. I'm glad you're finding your way, Helen. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. As weeks passed, Helen found herself thinking about Madison's letter often. There was a genuineness to it that couldn't be faked, or if it could, Helen didn't want to believe so. Still, she focused on her own growth. She used the money from selling her paintings and her teaching income to convert the spare bedroom into a proper studio. She installed better lighting, bought a professional easel, and invested in high-quality materials. The transformation of the space mirrored her own, from a room holding on to the past to a place of creativity and future possibility. Helen continued taking online courses to improve her technique. She joined a virtual critique group where artists shared their work and offered constructive feedback. Her style evolved, becoming more confident, more distinctively her own. At one of her community center workshops, Helen met Thomas Mercer, a retired art teacher who had moved to Vermont after his wife's passing 3 years earlier. He stood in front of her autumn landscape for a long time, then turned to her with eyes that seemed to understand exactly what she'd been trying to convey. You've captured the moment just before the leaves fall, he said. That perfect pause when everything is most beautiful and most fragile. Helen smiled. Sometimes endings are the most colorful part of the journey. They talked for over an hour that night about art techniques, about loss, about starting over when the world expects you to simply fade away. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people connecting over shared experiences. Thomas asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. Helen surprised herself by saying yes. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and a shared passion for creativity. Meishuan. Thomas didn't need Helen to take care of him or sacrifice for him. He simply enjoyed her company, her perspective, her growing confidence. For the first time in her life, Helen was in a relationship where she was valued for exactly who she was, not for what she could give or do for someone else. A year after Madison's first letter, Helen decided it was time. She called Madison and invited her to visit. The day of the meeting, Helen felt nervous in a way she hadn't anticipated. She tidied the house, made tea, and waited. Madison arrived looking different, simpler somehow. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her face free of makeup, her clothes casual and practical. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Their greeting was awkward. Neither quite knew whether to hug or shake hands or simply nod. They settled for a brief, slightly stiff embrace before Helen led Madison inside. "You've changed things," Madison said, noticing the transformed spare room, now a proper studio with Helen's paintings on every wall. "Yes," Helen replied. "I decided it was time." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they'd once painted together. But now it felt like neutral territory, a place to start over. Perhaps? Madison pushed the small package across the table. "I made this for you. It's not much, but..." Helen unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a hand-bound sketchbook, its cover decorated with pressed flowers and hand lettering that spelled out beginnings. "I made it in my bookbinding class," Madison explained, her voice soft. "I've been taking some art electives. Turns out I still love it." Helen opened the sketchbook. The pages were blank except for the first one, which held a simple sketch: the old swing, the daffodils, and Max. Underneath, Madison had written, "Some memories deserve to be redrawn." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she managed. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Madison said, tracing a pattern on the tabletop with her finger. "About who I became, about how I treated you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now. What you did with the money. It was right." Helen studied her granddaughter's face, looking for signs of deception. She found none, just regret and something else. Hope. Perhaps. "College is different than I expected," Madison continued. "Harder. Not just the classes, but managing everything on my own. Mom helps, but she has her limits. I'm learning what things really cost, not just money, but time, effort, sacrifice." Helen nodded. "That's a valuable lesson." "I saw your article in the arts magazine," Madison said, "and Thomas told me about your classes when I called him." "You called Thomas?" Madison looked down. "I found his number in the community center bulletin. I wanted to know how you were doing before I contacted you directly. I didn't want to upset you more." That was thoughtful, a word Helen wouldn't have associated with Madison a year ago. "Would you..." Madison hesitated. "Would you show me your studio? I'd love to see what you're working on." Helen led Madison to the transformed spare room. Canvases lined the walls, landscapes, still lifes, and a few abstract pieces exploring emotions Helen had never allowed herself to express before. "These are amazing," Madison said, moving slowly around the room. "You've always been talented, but these, they have something more." "Freedom," Helen said simply. Madison nodded. "I can see that." They stood in silence for a moment, the afternoon light filtering through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between them like unspoken words. "I brought my sketchbook," Madison said finally. "The one I've been working in for class. Would you want to look at it? Maybe give me some feedback." The request was so unexpected, so reminiscent of a younger Madison seeking approval, that Helen felt something shift inside her. "I'd like that," she said. They spent the next hour at Helen's work table, heads bent over Madison's sketchbook. Madison's technique was raw but promising. Helen offered gentle suggestions, showed her how to create depth with shading, how to make her lines more confident. It wasn't the same as before. Both of them were too aware of the pain between them for that. But it was something new, something honest. As Madison prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "I've been saving," she said, "for next semester. And for art supplies, real ones, not the cheap set I've been using." Helen nodded. "That's good. I was wondering." Madison shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Maybe sometime, if you wanted, we could paint together. Not like before, but just as two people who love art." Helen considered this. The old Helen would have jumped at the chance, hungry for any connection, But the new Helen knew her worth now. "We could try that," she said carefully, "one step at a time." And Madison's smile was small but genuine. "That's all I'm asking for." After Madison left, Helen sat in her studio looking at a blank canvas she'd been saving for something special. She thought about painting Madison again the way she used to be, or perhaps the way she was now, a young woman learning difficult truths. But instead, Helen began sketching a different image, a woman standing at a crossroads, one path leading back to the past, another stretching toward an unknown future. Here's some begin. The woman looked like Helen, but with a strength in her posture that had been missing for too long. In the following weeks, Helen worked on this painting between classes and coffee dates with Thomas. She didn't rush it. Each stroke was deliberate, thoughtful. Madison came by every other weekend. Sometimes they painted together. Sometimes they just talked. Helen learned about Madison's classes, her struggles and small triumphs. Madison learned about Helen's exhibition, her growing circle of friends, her relationship with Thomas. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something new, not the unrealistic closeness of Helen's memories or the transactional relationship it had become, but something based on mutual respect and the shared language of art. Lauren remained distant, still struggling to understand Helen's transformation. But even that felt like progress. Helen was no longer expected to smooth things over, to sacrifice her feelings for family harmony. On a crisp autumn day, nearly a year after the birthday party that had changed everything, Helen finished her painting. She called it Freedom. It showed the woman at the crossroads. But now she was no longer hesitating. She was walking confidently toward the unknown path, arms outstretched to embrace whatever came next. Behind her, golden leaves swirled in the wind, letting go, moving on. When Madison saw it during her next visit, she stood in silence for a long time. "It's you," she finally said. "But it's also everyone who's ever had to choose between what's comfortable and what's right." Helen smiled, surprised by Madison's insight. "Yes, exactly." "Are you going to sell it?" Madison asked. Helen considered this. No, she decided. "This one stays with me, to remind me." Madison nodded. "I understand." The local gallery had offered to display Freedom alongside a print of the rejected gift in a small exhibition of Helen's work. On opening night, Thomas stood proudly by her side. Madison came too, bringing along a reluctant Lauren. As they stood together looking at the two paintings side by side, the pain of the past and the promise of the future, Helen felt a remarkable sense of peace. The hurt wasn't gone, some injuries leave permanent scars, but it no longer defined her. She had transformed it into something beautiful, something that could speak to others who felt invisible, undervalued, used. The studio around her, the classes she taught, the relationships she was building with Thomas, and a slowly changing Madison. These were all parts of a life she had never imagined for herself. A life where she wasn't just someone's mother or grandmother, but Helen Carter, artist, teacher, woman of worth. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Helen stood alone in front of her paintings. She thought about the journey from that birthday party to this moment, from invisibility to recognition, from giving everything to finally receiving. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to begin again, to love yourself the way you've loved others. And that gift, unlike the one she'd given Madison, could never be rejected, because its worth came not from how others valued it, but from how she valued herself. As Helen stands alone in the gallery, gazing at her two paintings side by side, the rejected gift and freedom, she sees more than just canvases and color. She sees her journey mapped in brushstrokes, from invisibility to recognition, from boundless giving to balanced living. from painful rejection to profound self-acceptance. The painting that Madison once mocked as cheap now hangs with dignity. Appreciated by those who recognize true value isn't measured in dollars, but in authenticity. Yet the most precious masterpiece isn't hanging on any wall. It's the woman Helen has become. A woman who no longer shrinks to make room for others. A woman who knows the difference between sacrifice and self-erasure. Madison's path toward understanding remains uncertain. Genuine growth takes more than apologies and good intentions. Lauren still struggles to see her mother as more than a resource to be tapped. But Helen now stands firmly in her truth, paintbrush in hand, creating a future unburdened by expectations that were never hers to carry. Oi! With Thomas by her side, a community that values her talent, and a newfound relationship with Madison built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Helen faces forward. She's no longer defined by who loves her or who doesn't, but by what she creates, what she gives, and what she finally allows herself to receive. Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones we give ourselves the permission to begin again, to matter on our own terms, to paint outside the lines of others' expectations. And these gifts, unlike the ones we offer to others, can never be rejected because their worth comes not from how others value them, but from how we finally learn to value ourselves.